Vincent, time to wake up. A sing-song voice pulled me from my stupor as sunlight beamed into my eyes. The smell of coffee reverberated through my senses like a siren's song, and wrapped me in its sultry embrace. I cleared my throat of the glob of goop that always resided in it every morning, the price of living in the histamine palace that my house was, and spoke. "Coming, babe." My voice was gravely as it adjusted to its new state of being awakened. I sat up and awkwardly stretched out my arms. My eyes glanced at the copious amounts of ink I had covering them. Tattoos had become a coping device for me shortly after my best friend succumbed to his battle with addiction that left him absent from my world, but never my heart. The first tattoo I got was actually for him. It was a tattoo of the popular video game character Link, our favorite game to play together being The Legend of Zelda, Majora's Mask. My best friend, Matt, had Navi, the fairy that guided Link in all of the other Legend of Zelda games. Despite that, Navi was missing from our favorite game, and Link spent a lot of the game looking for her. We thought this was the perfect tattoo combination back then, because Matt was always guiding me in life, and helping me find myself, much like the characters in the game. That was 20 years ago. We had gotten together in that musty shop and gotten ink to commemorate the importance of our friendship. 10 years ago, March 22nd, 2011, I got the call that changed my life. Matt had lost his battle, and I made the journey to the other side of the country to lay him to rest. I remember musing about how someone with such deep internal conflict was always there for other people. He was spinning out of control for years, but whenever I had a rough day, he always picked up the phone and gave me the best advice, never letting on to his strife. "Vinny." The sing-song voice of my wife brought me back to reality. I realized I had been well and truly zoning out, starting at that pixelated tattoo. I swung my legs over the side of the bed, and did my best to silently sneak out of my room, down the hall and to the kitchen. I prowled out of the dark hallway, and lightly stepped toward the unsuspecting woman flipping eggs in front of the stove. As a trepidatious toe inched out of my hiding spot, I was interrupted by a huge creak. "Honey, if you ever want to get good at scaring me, you'll have to fix the floor in this ancient house," my wife, Veronica, said with a smile as she turned around, amusement heavy on her face. I stood up and closed the distance to her, wrapping her in a vast hug and taking in the serenity of my morning. A few minutes later, I was sitting at the breakfast table, enjoying another wonderful meal prepared by my wife. Both of us were homebodies, and both of us were people who took great joy in the ritual of everyday life together. I think Veronica and I never had children, because we were scared of what would come of the enormous change in our lives, and there was the other thing. I was always terrified that if I had a child, they would turn out like Matt. Intelligent, kind, deeply understanding, but self-destructive, careless with their own life. I couldn't watch another person I loved destroy themselves in front of me. As I sipped my perfectly blended coffee and stared at my wife, a visage of beauty in the morning sun, I fell into a memory of my friend. Matt and I sat over a small fire we had lit in the shelter of the partially collapsed battery factory on the outskirts of our town. He had an old set of camping pots and pans painted in that signature blue with white dots every family seemed to have. He boiled stale coffee over the fire, and while it smelled burnt and long gone, it brought me joy. I swept a bunch of these when we stayed at the Budget Inn. "Figured we should get our money's worth, and I know you love your coffee," Matt said with a laugh, stirring his pot of what used to be coffee. "Always looking out," I said, smiling back at him. I looked around our little camp. The roof of the factory had long since caved in, leaving us exposed to the elements. However, we fashioned a tent from some old sail canvas, and used discarded factory equipment to hold it up. The floor of our tent was made of various wood beams we had built into the ground, with coats long forgotten in the town's public library lost and found as our bed. The factory was ominous, our camp being the dead center of the abandoned factory floor, right where the assembly line used to live. The camp was outlined by ramshackle stairs that led to the upper floor of the factory, which only contained the plant manager's office and an employee break room. Both were far too musty and disgusting to call camp, despite the shelter, and was at risk of collapsing into the building every day. Matt and I chose to set up camp where everything had already fallen in, so as to protect ourselves from future cave-ins. I'll go flash my goods at the fruity guys who want some outside of the marriott. Matt would joke, unknowing that this was eerily similar to his actual forthcoming fate. I'll go mow Mrs. Murphy's lawn and take my shirt off halfway through. She always pays an extra $15 when I do that. I would reply with a laugh. Bro, Stacy will straight up beat you up if you do that. Mrs. Murphy is her mom. Matt would say before we both break out fits of laughter, the coffee boiling over. The taste of real coffee dancing across my lips and into my palate woke me from my trance as I realized my wife had been talking. Her face twisted into a mask of frustration, and I immediately knew I was in trouble. I'm sorry, Veronica, I was thinking about Matt again, I said shamefully, staring into my swirling coffee. Her anger disappeared as soon as it came, and she reached for my hand and squeezed. Vince, I just gave you a whole speech preparing you for this, and I'm not repeating it, so here goes. I'm pregnant. 3 months pregnant. I didn't know until my physical last week. I've been waiting to tell you, Veronica said softly to me, the need for approval tugging at her eyes gently. Oh God, we're too old, I exclaimed before laughing heartily. When I saw her face twist into a show of sadness, I reached to her hands and squeezed them gently into my own, and mustered my best attempt at a paternal smile. It'll be okay, I said softly to her. In the coming months a lot of things had to change for us. We had to leave our West Coast overpriced shed of a house, as there was no room for our upcoming child. Since we were already moving, we decided to give my hometown a try, and the houses were much cheaper, and our money would go a lot further. Plus, there was the benefit of my massive family that had come a long way in recent years toward being some semblance of normal. We ended up living in a beautiful home right on the river that divided the town into 2 sections, and I swear when you watched the sunset from our porch, it felt like it was setting just for you. The due date grew closer, and it became apparent we were bringing twin girls into the world, and the excitement grew with each day. My wife and I sat on our patio, overlooking the water, and bickered about names. How about Allison and Audrey? Veronica said, lacing her fingers over her bulging belly. I smiled, reminiscing over how not that long ago, I couldn't fathom the idea of being a father, but now, it was all I wanted. Of course I was still scared they would end up like my lost best friend, but I was filled with so much more hope than before. I know it's dorky, but what about Zelda for one? It's a pretty name, but you know, it meant a lot to me once upon a time. Veronica sneered for a moment before correcting herself. I don't really love it for our child's name, but I think you should definitely let them know how important it was to you, she said softly, leaning against me. Too bad I don't have a copy anymore, I trailed off as I fell into another memory. I sat in my shared apartment with Matt, his belongings packed away in big brown boxes. I sat on my cheap futon, sadness pulling at me. Alright man, I'm skipping town. Gonna make it big and Nick, and since your sorry ass is going the other way, I wanted to celebrate all the time we had together. Matt said, patting me on my arm, with a fresh set of ink sporting my new tattoo on it. I whined as the brand new tattoo of Link sent shockwaves of pain up my arm. I looked to Matt, who was holding 2 suitcases, one with a luggage tag showing his name, the other with that day's date. The next morning, Matt took on the journey to New York, where things would fall apart and change rapidly. Wait, I do have a copy, I said excitedly to Veronica, a massive smile tap dancing across my lips. Great, Veronica cooed, warmth emanating from her. It's in my time capsule I buried at the battery factory, I said, practically foaming at the mouth. That's it, I'm going up there tomorrow. Is that safe, babe? Veronica said softly, reaching for my shaking hand. Course it is. Matt and I lived there for a long time, I said, brushing my wife's concern off. And the next day, at 11 a.m., I was lacing up my boots and heading out to the factory on the outskirts of town. I gave Veronica a kiss, grabbed my car keys, and walked out the door, her please, be careful, hun, ringing in my ears as the door swung shut behind me. I started up my car, and made the trek across town to the trail that led to the factory. As I approached the destination, woods thickened around me, and houses became more and more sparse, until I found the overgrown trail to the factory. The trail used to be a road leading in, but it was fully reclaimed by nature at this point, and little more than a deer trail. You stay out of there, Vincent Green. A scratchy voice called from behind me. I whipped my head around to see a cottage overlooking the entrance to the trail, with a little old lady knitting, swinging on her porch. I recognized her immediately, Mrs. Parker, the woman who worked at the battery plant in the 1960 SC, and originally tipped Matt and I off to its existence. Mrs. Parker had found us wandering around with all of our earthly belongings on our backs, and called us over to her porch. She had given us a great big box of canned goods, $20, and pointed us in the right direction. She'd also regaled the story of the battery factory. I started working there when I was 16, and by the time I was 21, it had blown sky high. Mr. Hawthorne was the plant manager, and he worked us hard as he could. He was especially hard on me, being a woman and all. In fact, he worked us round the clock. Well, we didn't have no breaks or nothing, he barely let me pee. One day, that big Hawthorne right in the nads, because the lay Billy Charles had been working 74 hours a week, basically living in that break room. Billy's job was to make sure the exhaust didn't build up or nothing. Billy fell asleep in the boiler room, and instead of releasing the pressure when it was time, he was off in dreamland. The boiler exploded, and caught on fire. The sparks ignited the batteries. The whole place went up like a powder keg with 162 people, including Hawthorne and Billy. I was right here on this porch. I just got home from my shift. Hawthorne had sent me home early, because it was my monthly, and he didn't like all the breaks I was taking. Being a woman saved my life that day. There's one thing though. The blast didn't kill them all instantly, and like I said, I was right here. They ran down that path yonder and they were melting. The lithium pouring down their skin like oil, and the flame wearing them like this season's top pick. I saw good old Hawthorne, screaming for his mama, more incinerated flesh than man. He made it to the street, when the fire burned through the flesh of his stomach, and those charred intestines fell out like worms out of tin can. I remember the sound of them hitting the pavement right before he did, still crying for mama till he couldn't cry no more. "Hey Mrs. Parker," I said, jogging over to her. "Where's that man of yours?" Mrs. Parker said with a hearty laugh, struggling to rise and meet me. I scaled the steps easily and reached for her hands, taking them in my much larger ones, and helping her to her feet. I didn't even bother to correct her, at least the ancient woman was an ally. Matt actually passed on, a long time ago. "I'm actually going to collect some of his things we buried," I said, giving her a warm smile. "I'm so glad to see you, Mrs. Parker. You too, sweetheart, and I'm so sorry to hear that. You really look wonderful these days." My, if I was 20 years younger, she trailed off into a cackle, then her eyes flicked to the trail. "Vincent, please stay away from there. It's not like when you were younger. Things are different these days." Mrs. Parker looked at me pleadingly as she said these words. "Oh, I'll be fine. I'm a big scary man with tattoos now," I said, widening my smile at her. "Hold on then," she said, scurrying into her home, then returning with a Snubness 44 Magnum. "Oh my God, Mrs. Parker," I said, looking at it like it was a snake. "No sweetie, there are things out there. Take this too." I hadn't seen before, but in her other hand was a silver cross, on a bound leather cord. Did she think I was Van Helsing? I took the items to appease the older woman, mostly out of the deep gratitude I would always hold for her, for she had always looked out for Matt and I. There were countless nights she would allow us to stay with her in her home when it was freezing, or leave leftovers out for us. I gave her a final hug, grabbed my shovel from my car, and descended down the path to the abandoned factory. The trail was dense, and smelled of honeysuckle. I could hear birds chirp, and squirrels scamper about. A smile tugged at my lips. Matt would love this hike. The outline of the factory filled my eyesight, and as it did, I noticed the birds had abandoned me with their symphony of chirping. The smell of honeysuckle also subsided to that of charred chemicals, which was strange because I didn't remember the factory smelling like this. An eerie feeling planted itself in my stomach, making home there, as I approached the factory. I had the gun tucked into my hoodie pocket, and the necklace around my neck. The shovel teetered in my hand as I walked into the cavernous space that used to be the factory floor. It looked the same as it had in my youth. Sunlight streaming down into the floor, the plant manager's office and the break room, both still accessible via rickety staircase. One difference was apparent, however. Rubble had been cleared away to create access to the boiler room, which was never clear when I was younger. Someone must have taken the time to clear this up so they could explore. I chalked it up to some more kids. I thought about exploring myself, but I decided it was something for a younger man, and I didn't want to mess around and throw out my back. Plus, I had a wife and soon-to-be children to get back to. I found the spot I was sure the time capsule was in and got to digging. "Why, Vince? Why did you let me go? Why didn't you tell the truth?" he said in a wobbly, distorted voice. "I never lied to you, Matt. What are you on about?" I said frantically, hand finding the gun in my pocket. "Oh, now you're going to shoot me? Go ahead, kill me twice. This is your fault," he said, practically screaming. My heart was beating louder and louder, defeating me as Matt drew closer. "Do it. Shoot me," he said, screaming as dirt flew from his decayed lips. "No," I said, shutting my eyes tight and curling into a ball. "It's not real," I said in sobs. Viscous grief racked my body, and before I knew it I had passed out. I awoke and things had changed drastically. It was dark out now and the empty factory was no longer barren. It was my camp, and I was in my tent, Matt next to me sleeping. I immediately put a hand on his shoulder and gave him a firm shake, and he turned to look at me. I took in his features, smooth skin and glossy tired brown eyes stared back at me. His black curls framed his face with ornate beauty, and the moonlight dazzled his olive skin, that gave him the appearance of a Greek statue. Matt looked like someone God took a while to perfect the beauty of. He was not traditionally beautiful. His features were unique but stark and striking. My eyes cast to his lips and I stared for a moment, my mind flashing to the image of the decayed lips that had screamed at me moments earlier. Finally, my eyes flashed to my own arm, firmly connected to his shoulder, and I noticed all of my tattoos were gone. I glanced to my own body, and I realized that I was no longer that grown man I had been moments ago, and I instantly knew I was back in the summer of 1998. "Matt, where are we?" I said in a hushed whisper, jarred by the change of scenery. "We're at camp, silly," Matt said, yawning and chuckling at the same time. "Matt, no, you're dead," I said, panicked, sitting straight up, eyes darting around. It was indeed our camp, late at night. The fire flowed in a faint orange hue, embers clinging to life. "Did you have a nightmare?" Matt said, suddenly concerned with my state, worry flashing through his eyes. "No, this isn't real," I said, springing to my feet and beginning to pace around the campsite. Matt jogged over to me, and put a marble-like hand onto my arm, and pulling me close to him. "Vin, it is real. You're okay. You're safe," Matt said in a calming tone, looking at me like I was all that mattered in the world at that moment. No, it's not 1998, I am not 16, and you are not alive anymore." I was being overtaken by anxiety in that moment, not wanting to be living in this hallucination any longer. "Vince, I think you need to sleep this off, man," Matt said, pulling me back to our tent. He pulled me into the makeshift bed we shared, and my heart rate slowed as I stared up to the constellations above me. I watched the stars shine and away, bestowing an image that reminded me of the curve of my wife's face. "Matt, I need to get back to my wife. I don't belong here. I'm about to have 2 kids. Please help me get back," I said, voice cracking with sadness as the toll of the situation weighing on me. "Vince, just go to sleep. Things are going to be better in the morning. You just need some rest," Matt said softly. I then thought to what happened before I woke up here, Matt's words ringing in my mind. "Why, Vince? Why did you let me go? Why didn't you tell the truth? I need to ask you something, Matt," I said, turning to Matt and looking at him intently. "Of course," Matt said, greeting me with a warm smile. "Do you think there's something I'm not telling you?" I asked cautiously. Matt looked up to the stars, eyes flashing with ponderous wonder. "I do, but I think if you're not ready to acknowledge it, it's not my place to push it," Matt said carefully, turning his eyes back to me. I reached out to his cheek, tracing his cheekbone with my index finger, and taking in his cool, smooth skin. I thought about his words, and his calm, relaxed demeanor. Why had I followed him here in 1998? Why did I throw everything away to give my days to this boy? Why did Matt give up everything he had to ensure my happiness in whatever small way he could? "This isn't what was supposed to happen," I said softly, looking at Matt with immense shame. Hurt flashed across his face, and he spoke. "What do you mean?" Matt said quietly. I reached for his hand and began to speak when I heard a screech. "What was that?" I said, suddenly alarmed. Matt scrambled to his feet and pulled me up with him. He tore through his backpack and pulled out the snub-nose 44 Magnum that Mrs. Parker had given me in my own reality and a flashlight. Matt handed me the flashlight and spoke. "It might be a coyote. Flash that around and I'll see if I can spook it," Matt said firmly, looking at me with resolve. I simply nodded and followed him out of the tent. "Hello," Matt said in a louder, deeper voice than usual. And with the horrifying sound we heard skittering coming from all around us. I flashed my light around and saw black figures darting around the corners of the empty factory. I looked to the staircase, leading to the plant manager's office, and saw something slinking down like liquid. I shined my light to the entrance to the boiler room, which would have covered in 1998. Shadows upon shadows slinked out and skittered toward us. One shadow scampered 6 feet away from us, and I took in its image. It looked like it had once been a man, but now it was a burnt dark hunk of flesh. Its eyes were half melted, lips receded, organs visible if they were accounted for. Bone clanked against bone as the jaw opened and closed, letting out a horrific shriek. Matt had shot the creature in the neck, and the viscera and flesh went flying, knocking the creature off balance and startling the others. I began to cry, realizing there were at least dozens of these things surrounding us, maybe hundreds, and there was nowhere to go. The creature Matt had shot stumbled back to his feet and shrieked again. Matt grabbed my wrist and dragged me toward a wall of the creatures, and as he drew me near, the smell of battery acid was overwhelming. We ran toward the creatures, and Matt hurtled toward them. He bounded through the wall of creatures, knocking them out of our way and pushing us toward the forest line. As he did, the creatures reached for us, ripping and tearing at us. One even sunk its teeth into the soft flesh of Matt's shoulder. Matt let out a cry, and fired the gun in the creature's direction. As the creatures thinned out, we reached the line of the forest. We raced into the woods, and we both dared to glance behind us. The creatures were shambling after us. One creature ran, much faster than all of the others, and it looked over them. It ran on long, spider-like legs, mere bone and emaciated flesh. Whether this had once been a man or a mere product of the culmination of chemicals and tragedy, I had no idea. It let out a massive roar and descended upon us. Matt quickly turned, and landed a shot right to its core, knocking it over. Matt turned to me, and grabbed me tightly in his arms for a moment. Matt kissed me softly for a fleeting moment and spoke. "It's not your fault, I don't blame you, please stop blaming yourself. I love you, Vincent." "Let me go," Matt said hurriedly. "Now go." "I'll hold them off," Matt said, pushing me forward, away from him and the creature. I ran as fast as I could, but somewhere in the distance, I heard a sickening crunch. I ran and ran until I found Mrs. Parker's home. I looked down to myself and saw my tattoos had returned, and I was back to normal. I sat down on her swing and panted heavily. Soon, I had fallen into a deep slumber. I awoke to Mrs. Parker nudging me awake. "Come inside, Vince. I made you breakfast," she said sweetly. I ate a quiet breakfast with Mrs. Parker, the night flashing over and over in my mind. I heard a knock on the door and Mrs. Parker spoke again. "It's for you," she said quietly. I got up, and strode over to her door, and cracked it open. Sitting there was the suitcase containing my memories with Matt. A note sat upon it, folded neatly. I recognized the looping calligraphy as Matt's handwriting. "I'll always be here to guide you." Below it was a stamp of the little fairy tattoo he had to match mine. "I love you too," I whispered under my breath. I thanked Mrs. Parker for all she'd done for me over the years, and bid her farewell. I promised her I'd bring the twins by when they were born and made the trek home. I returned to a worry-stricken Veronica, who had called just about every person she could think of to ask if they'd heard from me. I pulled her into my arms, as soon as I walked into her home, taking in the scent of almond wafting from her hair. I promised myself I would never doubt the love I had for her, or our family again. Veronica was my home now, and that didn't lessen what I had with Matt, it just was. I ended up being okay. I lost my phone, car keys, and some respect from my wife. She didn't know how I had gotten lost in the woods I had grown up in, but she said camping was off the table as a vacation. After the events I had lived through, I was more than okay with that. The lesson I had learned from this all was that when we lose people, they stay alive in the form of our grief. Their life force is the angst and sadness you pour into their loss. Despite this, there's another way. People live on in fondness and love as well, and until you bury that pain, that person will life on like a poltergeist. Once you let them go, however, it becomes less like a pain in your heart, and more like light in the dark. I look to Matt as my guide now. I have buried someone I truly loved, and I let him live in joy and fondness. We cannot keep those we love alive in the prison of sadness and loss. We must let them go, lest they become warped mockeries of what they once were to us. A symbol of pain and nothing more. My twins were born today, healthy and happy girls. We named them Natalie and Avi. My wife and I took them home a few hours ago, and I went to take a shower. Underdressing and preparing myself for the much-needed wash, I looked in the mirror, and behind me, I saw a ghostly figure with curly black hair, watching me. I smiled back at his figure and daydreamed for a moment about showing my girls the pictures of us, playing Majora's Mask, and telling them about Uncle Matt, who was always watching over us.